Hello and welcome to CX Files for 13th of April 2023. My name is Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
And I'm Peter Ryan. Mark, the European tour continues. I'm this week in Poland, taking a little bit of well-needed rest and relaxation and touring around what is an absolutely phenomenal country.
You should actually get a t-shirt printed with all of the different places that you visit for business each year. 2023 and a long list of different countries.
Yeah, no, there's definitely some cool ones on the list that we've done for 2023, and I anticipate there'll be some more exotic locales that will be visited in the coming weeks and months. But certainly one we're very excited about is going to be in Glasgow, Scotland at the end of May, the 30th and 31st for CX Outsourcers. Hope all our listeners from the BPO side have their tickets. We've got an amazing lineup of speakers, yourself included, Mark, and very much looking forward to seeing friends and colleagues from the BPO ecosystem converge in Scotland.
Well, I'm looking forward to going there. And I don't think that we've announced it publicly, but I'm certainly going to be focusing on the future of CX, especially looking at flexible working like gig CX. And, we've had a number of guests on the podcast in the past from companies like Live Exchange, Day. It's certainly an interesting subject. And my daughter's going to come with me as well, so she can say hello to you in Scotland.
Well, I'm looking forward. I have not had the chance to meet your little one. It'll be our first time just after her first birthday. So celebrations belatedly will take place.
Yeah, definitely. We'll do that. So why don't you introduce our guest this week, who I believe is down under?
Yeah, correct. Simon Kriss is a longtime friend of mine in the CX space. In fact, Mark, I've even known Simon longer than I've known you, which is saying something. So Simon has had quite a career. He has done a whole lot of work around the Asia Pacific region. He has lived in Hong Kong, working for various airlines. Most recently, he was doing some work with Expedia. Also was working for the BPO side, helping drive innovation and drive effectively positive change within at least one or two BPOs. Simon's now gone out on his own and has become an independent advisor. He's based himself just outside of Melbourne. And as you know, Mark, and as Simon and I discussed in the podcast, I'm a former resident of Melbourne. I did some university down there. It's one of my favorite places in the world. Not a city I get back to often enough, but what I thought would be interesting on the pod this week was to chat with Simon a little bit about what's happening in Australia from a customer experience management standpoint. In my opinion, CX in Australia is a topic that doesn't get enough discussion in broader global terms. It's a highly sophisticated, high value economy with some great innovations that have taken place over the course of the past 30, 40 years when it comes to commercial products, when it comes to services. But in the broader point of discussion, we don't hear a lot about it. So what I tried to do was dive into what were some of the key CX issues, what were some of the key CX challenges facing Australian businesses and consumers today. And as you would imagine, Simon didn't disappoint. It was a very lively, very raucous interview with two longtime friends that hadn't caught up in probably 3 or 4 years. And certainly, I think our listeners will be treated to a buffet of information about Australia that they may not have known, and some of which they might not have wanted to know.
That's definitely going to be a treat for everybody. I think that, I was hearing quite a lot about Australia and CX, but about a decade ago. And then It's been really, really silent since then. So it's definitely going to be interesting to catch up with this.
Yeah, and there are some amazing thought leaders in Australia when it comes to customer experience management. Simon is one of them. I would also say another longtime friend, Dr. Katrina Wallace, who is become really the AI guru from an Australian perspective, and I might add is now on the Dragon's Den, which is just amazing. And congratulations to Katrina for that. We've got Sharon Melamed from Matchboard, who is, again, very well known, highly respected in Australia as well as around the world. I think I'd be remiss not to mention Audrey William as well, who both you and I know, who has proven to be just an invaluable source of information about what's going on CX and BPO wise for Australia, as well as different parts of the APAC region. So, it's high time, I think, that Australia and the trends in customer experience management in Australia were brought to the forefront. And hopefully this will be one of a series of discussions where we can take these on.
Okay, excellent. So why don't we go straight to the interview with Simon Kriss?
Well, this is a very exciting CX file for me today because I'm speaking to an individual who I think I've known longer in the customer experience management industry than anybody else in the world. That individual is Simon Kriss, who joins us from his home just outside Melbourne, which is a city that I know very well, and a gentleman who I consider to be a longtime and very dear friend. Simon, it is great to reconnect with you today on the CX Files. Thanks for taking some time in your morning, my evening.
And thanks for the invitation, Peter. Your introduction dates us both a little bit, but I'm really glad to reconnect and chat.
So there's a lot of different aspects that we could pursue on our discussion today, Simon, whether it's Australia, whether it's CX, whether it's our shared interest in politics down under. But I will kick off our chat by just bringing the listeners' attention to the fact that the first time you and I met, I believe, was in Delhi at a conference in 2005.
That's absolutely correct.
And if memory serves correctly, you and I were chatting about the possibility about that same conference holding its 2006 edition in Egypt, which they actually did. And then we reconnected there.
That's correct. Yeah, that has been oddly enough, my one and only visit to Cairo.
And I would just point out as well that you were not actually part of the conference, but you came to help with the planning for the 2007 edition. You flew in from Hong Kong, and you flew out that same day. And that, I have to say, is probably one of the most impressive travel stories I've ever seen in my life.
I think it was a sign of the time, Peter. You were too all over the planet. The industry was exploding, and we were trying to keep arms around it as much as we could, and help influence and shape where it went.
And influence with you, Simon, is a very important thing because you've had a huge amount of influence in terms of how a lot of different spots in the Asia Pacific region have expanded. I know that you've always had an interest in Africa as well. And South Africa is a country close to your heart. Egypt, as we've talked about, even Botswana, I know, has come up a time or two with former contacts in that regard. But today, I want to talk to you a little bit about what are some of the key CX trends happening in Australia. And a little known fact that I think you do know, but many of our listeners don't know, is that, as I mentioned, I did have the chance to live in Melbourne for a while. I studied at university there. And that's where I had my first and only role on the front lines in a contact center, working for a major Australian telco in 1998, selling effectively what were the initial cable modems to different households around the country, which was a great experience, taught me a lot. But really, Australia, I think, is one of the most important and one of the most sophisticated CX markets in the world, but it's not one of the ones that's the most talked about. And that's what really we want to get into today. So, Simon, as a leading question or a lead-off question, can you give us, as somebody who's been involved in customer experience management in Australia for some time, maybe a bit of a lay of the land, a 40,000 foot view about what CX means in Australia? What are some of the key issues and some of the key challenges happening there?
Yeah, and that is a great question, and incredibly timely. I've just come back from a gathering of 350 CX leaders in Australia at a conference, and just listening to what the delegates were talking about with each other, even more so than what the sessions were about. But in the breakout is where I really find the gold by, listening to what people are talking about. And it's still a bit of a dichotomy in Australia. So there are those companies that are absolutely trying to push the envelope. They're using AI to model customer reactions to things before they do it. They're pushing right out there with, using conversational AI to do post-interaction evaluations and feedback rather than just but at the same time, you've got people that are saying, well, we're still really just getting into getting our call center right, or setting something up, or should we outsource or in-house? So it's a very interesting kind of thing that at the moment you've got leaders that are, way out in front, bleeding edge almost, and then you've got a pile of people that are almost in the laggard category, and there's very little in the middle of the bell curve, if that makes sense. Australia's always been, for better or worse, a country that likes to look around the world and see what others are doing, and then start to try and adapt and adopt that.
And that makes a lot of sense. As long as I've been covering the CX space, one of the things that I've noticed about Australia is that it's a location where people will indeed look to what's happening in the UK or the United States or different modern developed economies to see what they can do to adapt into the Australian CX model, so to speak. But one of the things that I've noticed as long as I've been covering the market as an analyst has been that Australia is probably one of the most pound for pound or dollar for dollar, one of the most expensive markets in which to deliver CX domestically. So Simon, my question to you on that point would be, what is driving these high costs in Australia? And what are companies doing to look to try and mitigate some of these, quite frankly, serious expenses, especially in a period of inflation that we've been seeing happening around the world the past 2 or 3 years?
Well, this just turned into a 2-hour podcast. It's interesting if we rewind back to pre-COVID, because there's been a huge fundamental shift during COVID, not surprisingly for anybody anywhere in the world. In the last 10 years pre-COVID, it was very much what you would expect, right? The costs are high because it's a highly unionized country. The social security system is very high, very expensive, and so pound for pound, Australians carry quite a lot of tax debt in their, as they go through. It would rival the US's tax system when you add federal and state in the US. So it's always been an expensive place to operate because you don't just pay salaries, you've got to pay superannuation, you've got to pay workers' comp insurance, and you've got to pay this, and you've got to pay this on top. So a number of people went down the path, initially they went down the path of outsourcing to the cheapest location. So a whole lot of call centers moved to India. And then the very parochial Australians didn't like talking to people with the Indian accent because they don't understand Australia and all those other rubbish reasons. And there started to be brand degradation. And so companies pulled it back. And then they started saying, well, hang on, we can go to places like the Philippines and South Africa where the accent isn't as strong. It's a little more neutralized, a little bit more sing-song. And we can still get that cost arbitrage of going to a lower location. And those types of things were fine. And then along came COVID. And the Philippines call center market kind of collapsed overnight. It's just struggled to get that many people working from home from a pure infrastructure point of view. It's not that they didn't want to do it, but the quality of internet to homes, the availability of laptops, because they had everybody on desktop machines and they couldn't send them home with desktops. A whole lot of things meant that industry just really struggled. And so Australia now is having to deal with having to bring all of that back on. One of our largest banks, Westpac, brought a ton of work back on shore and is back to doing it in Australia again. And now they're looking for the cost arbitrage through automation, through greater self-service. So what we saw in Australia during COVID was the largest amount of money ever spent on AI projects, automation projects, voice bots, things like that. I have a colleague who works for a government department and he's the head of voice AI for them. And he said he now has more projects funded than he can deliver. He doesn't have the staff to do it. So they've basically just thrown money at him to get that automation stuff happening. So it's a very interesting time in the market.
Yeah, and you mentioned the issues around the offshore and the extent to which offshoring has had its challenges from an ANZ perspective, or sorry, an Australia perspective. Well, New Zealand's a completely different kettle of fish. That's another podcast that we'll take up at some point. But from Australia's standpoint, we've been seeing a lot of movement or a lot of discussed movement towards South Africa. And I know that, Simon, you've had some experience in South Africa as a market. What do you see as some of the alignments between how Australian consumers can be serviced by South African agents? And are there any potential disconnects that maybe we're not talking about?
They absolutely can be serviced from there, and a number of our a number of companies in Australia do. Qantas, our flag carrying airline, has an outsourced call center in South Africa. I think if it's in areas where the South African accent isn't too thick, but even where it is, it's still more appealing to people than say someone with a Eastern European accent or an Indian accent or something like that. So it's an accent that fits well. Is it as good as Canadian? Probably not, but it's a nice accent. People can feel like they can interact quite well with it, and it's geographically, it's in the same thing. So people talking about it being winter now or being summer now absolutely aligns, rather than people that are in the northern hemisphere, because I've got to tell you, as an Australian, we don't get this whole burning Yuletide logs and going snow skiing in Christmas Day. For us, it's 34 degrees Celsius. So having that alignment helps a lot. It also helps with meeting times. When management needs to meet with management, it's not in anybody's nighttime. It's kind of daytime alignment, pretty much. And so there's some great alignments with South Africa, and I see it being a strategic partner for Australia going forward.
And it's interesting because, one of the things that really strikes me is, having visited South Africa many, many times over the course of the last 20 years, that culturally, I can't think of two countries that are more aligned in many ways than Australia and South Africa. And I'll relay an interesting story to you. About maybe 9 or 10 years ago, I was in Sun City and I was celebrating my birthday. I went to a little pub outside of the Sun City complex, and somebody said to me, "Well, it's a great time to be here because we're going to watch the Australia versus South Africa rugby match." I said, "Oh, that sounds like a lot of fun." And I was looking at the stadium, and it was just South Africans everywhere. And I said to the person, "Well, it's funny though. Why is the stadium dark? Why does it look like it's nighttime outside?" They said, "Oh, well, the game is being played in Brisbane." But I would dare say there was an equal number of South Africans in Brisbane as there were Australian fans. And with that in mind, it really speaks to the extent to which South Africa and Australia share this cultural alignment, considering how many Australians and South Africans live together in everyday neighborhoods.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're also bonded by the fact that we both want to beat England in the rugby.
That would work too.
It's a common bond.
Yeah, no. But Simon, going back to the discussion around costs, it's interesting the challenges that Australia has in this regard in terms of delivering contact center services. I remember a few years ago, I was doing a pricing study where we were looking at all the major developed economies. And what struck me immediately was I anticipated that France was going to come out as the most expensive location dollar for dollar in the world. It turned out to be Australia. And this is something, as you mentioned, with all the different administrative overheads, the unionization that the country has had to deal with over the course of an extended period of time. So, in your opinion, considering the amount of money that Australian consumers are paying for products and services, and considering the amount of money that organizations are paying for either captive centers or working with outsourcers that are working onshore, how is the value that the Australian consumer is getting from a CX perspective?
It's degrading, I have to say. Over time, the CX experience has been degrading. I think that's probably taken a pivot once again during COVID. We're seeing CX really coming back to the boardroom. I was at the conference for the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and there was a lot of discussion about customer experience and what did the customer experience look like, because they've all started to realize that they can't compete on product and they can't compete on price. So what have they got left to go with? But that said, there's still, if you talk to any Australian that uses an airline and ask them about the customer experience of all of the airlines in Australia, I guarantee 90% of those stories are going to be negative, because people are just feeling like where they need to cut corners, they're cutting corners around the experience. And that's not so much, that they're doing bad things. It's, I can't get through on the phones. I've got a half-hour wait in the call center. My flight got cancelled and nobody told me. Almost the proactive elements of CX are kind of getting, anything that's got a cost almost is getting stripped back. If they can do it cheaply, if they can message and things, they'll do that. But the high cost does definitely take a toll. A lot of call center managers will tell you that their budget is done top down, not bottom up. So the CFO says, this is the bucket of money that you've got. How many agents can you run for that? Rather than what kind of stuff do we need in our customer experience teams, and what's that going to cost the organization?
And, it's interesting you talk about airlines, Simon, because I'll relay a little experience I had from about a month ago. I was flying on a domestic flight on British Airways from Glasgow to London Heathrow. And when we landed, the bags took well over an hour to come off the belt. And this was incredibly painful for everybody waiting. And the comment that kept getting made was, we've spent more time waiting for the bags than we have actually flying from one end of the country to the other. And something that I picked up on that I thought was really interesting was the fact that, and you've visited the UK many times, I know, I find people in the UK very patient and very willing to put up with service disruptions and so forth, certainly much more than you find in North America. But people were spitting venom, and there was a huge amount of anger. And I think it's because of the challenges that customer experience is facing. As you were saying, it's degrading in Australia. Well, I think it's degrading in many different parts of the world. So my question to you is, how willing is the Australian consumer to go and make their voice heard? How willing are they to go to a call center agent or to a supervisor and extend their level of concern, if not rage, at how they've been treated, considering many of the different challenges that we're facing around managing interactions these days?
Yeah, and culturally, of course, there is some alignment between the UK and Australia. And so if if it's an inconvenience, you would kind of vote with your feet and just, no, I'm not going to use them anymore, or maybe you'll put an angry tweet out or something. If it's really affected you, I think then Australians will definitely be forthright. Particularly if Australians have this thing that if they feel they've been wronged, it must be made right type of thing. It's this, let's stand up and challenge. The other way in which we see it, and you just alluded to it in the airport, is if there's an experience that affects several people and they're close together, that herd mentality, they just pump each other up. One says this is no good, and the next one says this is outrageous, and the next one goes even higher. And that suddenly they've worked themselves up into this state of fury where, you can't even reason with them. But for the most part, Australians are quietly tolerating. So, they will tend to, oh, well, I just won't use that service anymore. I just won't use that product anymore.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Well, Simon, as we finish up our discussion here for the CX files, I just wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about what you're doing, because you've had a bit of a change of direction recently career-wise, and would love to find out a little bit more about what you're up to these days and how people can get a hold of you.
Well, thank you. I've launched the CX Innovation Institute, and we're really focused around forethought, future approaches to CX. So doing some research, writing white papers, things like that. And one of the exciting pieces of research that we're doing is we're leveraging our own tech for our own benefit. So we're using a conversational AI engine in reverse. So traditionally, as you would know, conversational AI is about starting with a world of possibilities and bringing that down to one intent. We're using it in the opposite direction. We're using it to go out and do research with 3,000 kids from age 14 to 19 to ask them, what do they think CX is? What do they think CX will be in the future? How do they want to connect with companies? How do they want to be serviced? And not just call center, but website, face-to-face. How do they see all of this working in the future? As an example, if a heap of them come back and say, well, we expect that we're going to get service in whatever replaces WhatsApp next, then why are we all still building voice call centers? So it's really trying to get that future focus and that innovation focused around how do we innovate faster? I mean, the world around us is exponential. We all know that. Everything moves at the speed of light now. And I think it was one of the Alice in Wonderland books where the Queen of Hearts says, to just stay still, you need to run as fast as you can. And that is very, very true in CX today. So that's where we're going to be going, and we're going to be publishing that research. The easiest way for people to stay connected is to find Simon Kriss on LinkedIn or any of the socials. I seem to have been able to capture my name on just about all the social platforms. Watch this space.
Well, the space is going to be very exciting, very productive, and very creative. As I can say, as somebody who's known you for about 20 years, congratulations on what you're doing, Simon. It's great having you on the CX Files. And I will just finish by saying it's interesting. If you go down towards Aldwych in London, there's two streets. One is named Melbourne Place. The street right behind it's Montreal Place. I think there's something there.
I agree.
Yeah.
And it's very good to see you, my friend.
It is very good to see you too, my friend. And we will look forward to having you on future discussions. Take care and all the best.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favourite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.